Thanks for coming to the DASH Behavioral Model group on May 18th. I think today is the day Mount St. Helens blew up a million years ago, or a long time ago anyway. I think it's the anniversary of that today. So,
Wow.
Yeah, I'm from Washington State, so I remember that. I think I was about 11 when that happened. Anyway, so I
This
am
day 1980.
What?
This day 1980.
Oh yeah, yeah. So it used to be a big, beautiful mountain. It was one of the most beautiful mountains in the world, and now it has a big hole right at the top. So if you ever come to Washington and want to take a drive, we could go look.
Beautiful hole.
Yeah, yeah. What I'm showing on this screen is what we talked about last time, which was, I think we kind of closed up this conversation yesterday about the ACL tags and things like that. So anyway, and we did talk a little bit last week about, or the week before, about the experiment that we're working on, but we, it wasn't the highest priority. So we have that. And then today we have these PRs in the queue. And I was wondering if, I think it was VJ might have something he wanted to talk about, or Clark if he joins the meeting from Alibaba. So I think that's what's on deck for today. Unless, Marian, did you have anything you wanted to talk about, or anyone else on the call?
No.
Okay, cool. So VJ, was it this one for today? 365?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. Did you want me to present, or did you want to present?
Yeah, I can quickly go over the PR.
Okay.
I can start sharing the screen.
Okay, I'm going to stop. So everybody knows VJ. He's presented PRs before.
Hey, can you guys
I
see
can
my
see.
screen?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, so yeah, I think this PR is basically addressing the design for metering, outbound metering that was presented and discussed earlier. The metering requirements and also the metering design is mentioned in the HLD. So and just as a quick overview, this is the outbound traffic metering behavior that we had discussed and accepted. So this is what is being incorporated into the BM-V2 pipeline with this PR. So there is basically a meter class ID coming from the policy table, outbound routing table, and outbound mapping table. There is also a meter bucket table. So there are two new tables being introduced in this PR, the meter policy table and the meter bucket table. And there are three new attributes coming from the routing and the mapping table. So there's a class ID, there's a policy enable Boolean, and then there's an override Boolean. So now we can just look at the PR, the changes in the PR. So yeah, so these set of changes are basically for the SI API generation. So because of the way the tables are defined, there was a need to introduce some new annotations for generating the table as an object. And so these changes address all the SI API changes for the new annotations. And just going ahead, yeah, so these are the P4 changes. So here we can see that in the outbound routing table, we have the meter policy enable and the meter class, which is coming from every routing action. And we have from the outbound mapping table, we have the same meter class, and then there is an override which is coming from the override Boolean, which is coming from the mapping table. And going further ahead from the ENI, we get the policy ID, So there is a V4 and V6 meter policy ID coming from the ENI table. So this is similar to ACLs where there's no inbound and outbound here. It's like V4 meter policy and V6 meter policy. So, but the way the meter policy is structured is similar to the ACLs where there's a policy table and there is a rule table. So the meter policy table has the meter policy ID and it just does the address family check, which is similar to the ACL group table that we have in BMV2. And then there is a meter rule table, which contains the actual rules, where you have the meter policy ID and you have the uh, a ternary match on the destination address. And the meter rule action itself can give the meter
DJ,
class. So
I didn't get one thing. The meter policy table, same table is applied in both directions, or we have a table per direction that can be applied for the same flow?
yeah, so I think this one right now I've only addressed the outbound direction meter policy. So there was a clarification required on the inbound direction, whether meter policy is really required from the requirements point of view or not. That is something that I need to check back with Prince and get back on that because yeah, I think
So
inbound
it
is
will be addressed separately.
yes, yes, correct. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
So meter rule table has the so this is more simple than the ACL rule table. It just has the meter policy ID and then the destination address, and the rule action.
Sorry, quick question. What is ternary?
Sorry. Yeah, this is basically priority based TCAM match. That's the requirements which was mentioned. There's a priority based a prefix match for meter policy. So that's why it is ternary here.
As opposed to a prefix? I guess that's my point.
As opposed to LPM, yeah.
I mean, if it's restricted to be prefixes, maybe a comment saying control plane must use prefixes might be appropriate.
Yeah, I think, yeah, sure, I can add a comment. But yeah, I mean, if you guys look at the SI API, which is generated, it becomes clear. But yeah, I can definitely add a comment here.
Well, I guess my comment was along the same line. If this API is supposed to be a prefix, the table can have some terminology to basically say use the side prefix type. That's what I'm getting at. But please keep going.
There's no P4 type that's prefix only other than LPM.
But you can specify a side. There's one example right above that on the policy ID. You see that side type. That's how you basically massage the type that side is basically posting.
I see. With the annotation, sure.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking about it.
Yeah, so yeah, I didn't really put the annotation here because the way this API got generated seemed to be in sync. So I just thought I'll just leave it as ternary.
Yeah, we'll get back to that one.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry.
Sure. Okay. So so then we have the meter class. So then finally we have the meter bucket where the actual counting happens. There's the outbound bytes counter and the inbound bytes counter. Now this meter bucket table itself is keyed upon ENI ID and meter class. And the meter bucket action is actually just the counter action. So there's nothing really happening here. So the way I've tried to model this in BMV2 is because we have two counters, outbound and inbound counters, we can't have like two direct counters for a table. So instead, I added two dummy tables, which are basically like meter bucket outbound and meter bucket inbound. And there are two direct counters attached here which is as per BMV2. And now depending on the direction coming in meta, we will either apply the outbound table or the inbound table. So this table is basically for the SI API generation, and these two tables are for BMV2. So there is a ignored table. So there is no SI APIs associated with the meter bucket outbound or inbound. But the SI APIs are associated only with this meter bucket table here. But in the BMV2 data path, the counters will increment either in the outbound or the inbound table. But there is one TBD here is that in the BMV2 scilib, we need to kind of stitch the right when we do a counter get on inbound bytes counter or the outbound bytes counter, we need to go and fetch the actual counter from the appropriate BMV2 table. So that is something that is not yet addressed. So.
BJ, do you think there could be some kind of a clever annotation that gives hints to the code generator that it could automatically do certain things in the SI adapter in this case?
Yeah, I think that is what I was thinking to do, but I thought I just wanted to get the SI APIs out there because, yeah, I think, yeah, that is one possible way to do this, that we have some kind of SI annotation here, which says that, hey, these two counters which are actually attributes, are tied to the counter here, the direct counter here in a different table. Now, if we can have some kind of annotation, then probably in the generator, we can like generate the code appropriately. Because unfortunately, yeah, this is yet another example of like SI API generation tied to BMV2, right? So it's like some idiosyncrasy of BMV2 spilling over to SI API generation.
Yeah.
So yeah, going on. So there is the yeah, this is where the actually the tables are getting applied. So if you have the policy enabled, which is coming from the route table, then you apply the meter policy and then you apply the meter rule. And so this particular logic is described here. So as you can see, the meter class can come from three different places in the pipeline. And we need a way to pick the right meter class table, which is ultimately used in the meter bucket for counting. So this has the basically the precedence logic. So the meter policy lookup, if it's enabled and meter policy gives the meter class, then that gets precedence and over the routing tables meter class. And the mapping can override it only if this mapping override Boolean is set. Otherwise, whatever is coming from the policy is taken. So, I mean, that whatever is described here is kind of defined in this uh, logic. So yeah, so finally you pick one meter class, which goes, there are policy meter class, route meter class, and mapping meter class. And finally, what goes to meter bucket is the one a meter class which is chosen based on the precedence rules. Uh, so, and this is the other one. So there is the meter bucket apply, which actually doesn't do anything, but I think the compiler didn't like it if I didn't apply this. So I'm just doing an apply here. And if the direction is outbound, then we do the outbound apply or inbound apply. Now, these two things are basically just incrementing the direct counters in BMV2. And that's the thing that we need to fetch. And these are the test changes. So just quickly, I just wanted to show the SI APIs which got generated. So we have the yeah, create meter bucket, and then we have the meter policy and then the meter rule. Uh, so the meter policy and the rule is yeah, okay. Before that, I just wanted to show the yeah, in the ENI, these are the new attributes which got generated in the SI API. So there's an ENI attribute V4 and V6 meter policy ID. And there is Yeah, there is in the CA to PA mapping, there is a new meter class and a meter class override. And in outbound routing, there is a new attribute which is an enable and then the same meter class. So I think in SAI API, it's called meter class everywhere. Only in the BMV2, I mean, that's because of the way the pipeline is defined.
Could you
But
go
yeah,
back to the meter definition?
in the sorry, in the SAI API?
Yeah, just to see the attributes.
Yeah. So this is the create meter bucket. And these are the attributes. So yeah, I think this was the interesting thing is for the rules. Yeah, so the ternary match, it becomes a dip mask kind of priority.
Can I
Yeah.
ask a question about this?
Mhm.
So I understand why you're saying it's not an LPM because it's got priority. But from the perspective of the masks will always be sort of prefix oriented
Yeah.
and not just arbitrary masks,
Correct.
right?
Yes. Yeah.
Like, is there any way we can express that in the API, like that the masks aren't allowed to be just like arbitrary random masks, but are prefix oriented?
And then like always consistent with longest prefix match?
Well, yeah. I mean, I understand why it's not like an LPM from the P4 perspective, and because it's got priority. But I think it's like if we know that these masks are always going to be in sort of a prefix form, I think then certain data planes could take advantage of that. And but if the API says it can be an arbitrary mask, then that's
Yeah.
a harder
Yeah.
thing to do.
Right. Yeah, agreed. So, yeah, I think we have a precedence for using dip as ternary, like in inbound routing also, there is a similar precedence where we have, I think there it is SIP, and it's a similar thing, SIP mask and priority. So I was just like kind of riding on that precedence. But yeah, you're right. I think I don't know if there's some way. Are you saying we should generate some comment here?
Yeah, maybe it's a comment, or maybe it's the API takes like a instead of a mask, takes like a length, and then that like by definition constrains what the masks can be. I'm okay if it's just a comment, but and you know, if an arbitrary mask came, we could fail the API. I just want to make sure that it's like at least known that the definition of this is that these aren't intended to be just like arbitrary masks, but sort of prefix-oriented masks.
But maybe it's already clear to you, John, if the intent is all the masks are all prefixes, and if the priorities are always longest prefix match wins, why does it
No,
make
but
sense
it's not.
to make it LPM?
No, it's yeah.
No, I think the reason is, Andy, that you could have like, let's say a more specific prefix that's at a lower priority. And so like the covering prefix at a higher priority would be what you want to match on.
Right.
So it would never match in the data plane during that time it was configured that way, but you could remove the higher priority one at any time and it would change.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
from a P4 like modeling perspective, like, you know, modeling it as ternary gives you this behavior. From an actual vendor implementation, there's lots of flexibility on how you might implement this.
Right.
So you'd like to
Exactly.
document it that it's
I'd like to constrain
always
it
a prefix
so that,
mask, but priorities are arbitrary on prefixes.
yeah, I'd like to constrain it so that the masks can't be arbitrary, that they have to be prefix oriented. Because that's really the requirement.
Right.
Yeah.
Understood.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, given the fact that this is a SCI IP address, hopefully it's, yeah, the mask is, it should not be given as arbitrary. So, yeah, we can look into that. But just one point is that we do have other instances which were introduced before, which kind of follow I'm just following the same pattern. But yeah, we should
I think
probably
the same
fix it.
comment would apply to all then as well.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think if the requirement is constrained, in that way, then we should express it somehow.
Yeah, got it. Okay.
Could you go to this API, the attributes that when you fetch the byte count? Where's that at?
Right. So that is yeah. So there is a so this is the meter bucket. So basically, yeah, when we create the meter bucket, we give the ENI in the class, which are as attributes, and then what you get is the meter bucket ID. So yeah, I mean, like in data
Sorry,
bucket can be yeah, and the
sorry,
get
what I
yeah.
meant is how do you retrieve the byte count?
Yeah, so okay, so this for the byte count, yeah, that's a good question. So I just so this is also something which is kind of unique to this meter bucket. So basically, there are two attributes which are meter bucket attributes, which are generated as read-only attributes. So the idea is that when we do a get on these attributes, we get the counter. Um, Now, yeah, we need to somehow tie this to the BMV2 direct counter. That's the scilib part that I was talking about, which is not yet done.
So two comments here. It's also a little wasteful to have both an inbound and an outbound byte counter in the same meter because a lot of flows are unidirectional, right? That's the first comment. And second is, how do you do, if it's read-only, how do you clear a counter?
So, yeah, so I guess the inbound and outbound, because it's tied to a flow, right? So anytime a flow is created, you have the bidirectional flow created. In other words, in the data path, you are provisioning both the counters. Whether it increments or not is dependent on how the actual packet path is. But I think the byte counters itself are like actually provisioned in the hardware. And as to the clearing part, so I believe create because it's tied to a meter class and it's tied to like accounting traffic. When you create a new meter class and you are instantiating a new bucket, it starts off as a zero counter, and it pretty much increments for the lifetime of that meter class.
Okay.
Yeah. So that
I
is
mean,
what yeah.
any kind of platform, typically when you have counter, at least at the CLI level, you got show, clear, that kind of stuff, right? So do we even care to implement a clear here, or that's going to be taken care of by the upper layer, especially since if those are only 32 bits, they're going to roll. If they were 64-bit, that'd be different. But 32-bit, they're going to roll.
Right. So I think
do
we can make this 64-bit. That's something that I can check. So yeah, I think it should probably be a 64-bit counter. You're right. So we can change that part. As far as the clearing is concerned, I don't think that was part of the requirement, because once a bucket and class which is associated with the bucket is instantiated, it's pretty much exists till that class goes away. And probably a new class can use the same bucket ID, at which time it is anyway, it's a new create, and then it starts off as zero. So that's what I understand. So that's why there's no like a clear API here.
I mean, I guess if you make them read and write, then the set on that counter attribute will just work, correct? If need be.
So what is the requirement? Is it like the same bucket for both inbound and outbound traffic for the same flow? Is the way currently?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. A single meter class is associated with outbound and inbound.
And as a result, same bucket.
Same bucket. Yes, that's right. Yeah. One bucket has both the inbound and outbound counters. Yeah. Yeah, I guess the set is one thing that you can potentially use to clear it. So yeah. Yeah, I guess
If it's not part of the requirements, it's fine. But
yeah,
yeah, definitely make it 64-bit.
Okay. Okay, I'll look into that. Yeah. And the meter policy itself, the meter policy and the meter rule is similar to our ACL. The SI APIs is also pretty much similar. So you have the meter policy, you have the IP address attribute to create the meter policy, and meter rule just has the policy and destination IP, and that's
Yeah,
about
you
it.
got to be
Yeah.
careful with this statement because the ACL code in P4 has a compile flag, and what gets generated out of the box is not what it's supposed to be. We're supposed to have list of prefixes, whereas out of the box it generates just an IP address. So be
Okay.
careful about this.
Oh, yeah. Right. So I think we don't have that list, at least here. Per meter rule, there's only one IP address. Yeah. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. So I think that there's a discrepancy, right, between what BMV2 says and what API is generated for ACL rules.
Well, what they're supposed to be.
Right.
There's no the crystal out of the box. It's the same, but it's not complete. It's not Dash compliant, I suppose.
Okay. Yeah, I think here it's just one single IP address. So I think here there is no real discrepancy because it's much more simpler, right? It's just one IP address that you want to match on. Yeah. So yeah, I guess that's it. And I think yeah, I was having some trouble just with because the new attributes were added. I was having some trouble getting the tests to pass, the existing tests to pass. So working with Chris on that one. Thanks, Chris, for helping with that, and Chris and Andrew also. So I think Andrew is looking at making some size C changes to make these tests pass.
This is
I, I,
very comprehensive PR. Well done.
That's huge.
Quick question following up on something Shitanshi asked earlier. You said that there should be counters that can be updated for a mix of some outbound and some inbound packets. That should be possible to configure. Some
yeah,
meters. So
yeah.
would it?
So
Go
sorry, you
ahead.
mean in the BMV2?
So in the BMV2, it sounds like you made it so that's impossible to do.
Oh yeah. So I think the BMV2, the problem I faced was the direct counter the specification here. This is something that BMV2 already supports. So, but you can only support one type of counter. Like what I really needed here was like a way to give like two direct counters. And in this statement, if I could say like counters equals outbound comma inbound or something like that.
So you can, if you don't, there's another extern called a counter without the word direct underscore in front of it.
Oh, that
That's
is a
basically,
table counter. That yeah, I looked at that. That was
well,
just the table.
I mean, you give it's an array number from 0 to size -1, and you can specify an index that you want to update in that array.
Okay. So I guess, but there was the other problem here is that we have actually there is some logic involved, right? To like to increment the right counter table. We have to look at the direction in the meta and then increment either outbound or inbound. So yeah, it was kind of hard to like do that.
Because what are the keys that those outbound and inbound tables match on? They match on
Uh,
the same things, right?
Correct. Yes.
So you're saying the set of meter class values and ENI ID values will be different for outbound and inbound potentially?
No. It'll be the same. It'll be the same.
Well,
This is
so then I would say why not? It would be actually closer to the desired effect if there weren't such an if condition with an outbound and inbound table. There was just one, regardless of direction. Isn't that closer to what the psi intention is?
Uh, but then we need to increment the right counter, right? Because based on the direction which is coming in the meta,
So
how would you do that?
does psi want to specify an index to update when it's
Uh,
an index into an array to update?
yeah, so I guess that is the meter bucket ID that we're talking about. So I mean,
Yeah,
this is
no,
basically a hash table of ENI and
right.
meter class, right?
So I'm just saying that there is if you don't use direct counter, you can have two counter indexes updated by the same table, two counter externs updated by the same table if you want, or one. I think the restrictions you're hitting are because of the direct counter, and if you replaced it with counter, maybe it's closer to the behavior you actually want.
Basically calling extern in an action, right, Andy?
The
But
actual action, you would say update index 17 in this array, or where 17 would be a parameter, probably an action parameter that the control plane would set.
And you can do several of those in one.
And you can update more than one in a single action.
I see. So this is, you're saying we can have that two counters defined in BMV2 and then have some extern which has the logic of actually looking at what I have here, right? Looking at the direction and
it sounds like looking at the direction is exactly what you don't want. From the verbal description that you answered Shitanshi earlier, you don't want to have different entries depending on the direction. I thought you want the same ENI keys and other keys.
Yeah.
So
yeah, but there are two different like attributes here, right? Like if you look at the side, the meter bucket table itself has two different counter values. There are two UN32s or 64s here, right? So we have to go and increment the right counter attribute. So that's what I'm trying to model here.
So you want a single key, and then you want it, depending on the direction of the packet, to update an outbound counter or an inbound counter?
Yes, exactly. Single key. Yeah, depending on that. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So, I mean, you could have a single counter. I mean, there's different ways to do this, but you could have two counter arrays and have an if statement in your action saying, if the direction is this, update this counter, otherwise update that counter.
Okay.
A single table.
I see. So, but then from what I understood from the documentation is that when you use a counter, it's not a per entry counter, it's a table counter. Maybe I'm wrong.
I mean, the direct counter is 1-to-1 with table entries. If you take off the direct underscore, it's just an array from 0 to size -1, not associated with any table, not fixed to be associated with any table. But you can update it from a table action.
I see. Okay. Okay. Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. Maybe. If you can just send me an example, because I'm also like pretty new to BMV2. So yeah.
Sure. No, I understood. Yeah, no, there's no reason you'd already know it out the gate. I'm just noticing a small potential difference and wondering if a small change would make it more closely matched.
Sure. Yeah. I think, I agree. Like if we can just collapse these two tables, because these are basically just because to accommodate that BMV2 direct counter, I introduced like there are three tables. So if we can just collapse it into one and then have some logic, perhaps it's more intuitive, right?
Yep, makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, maybe if you can like, provide an example offline, I can try to look at that. Right. Yeah. Thanks.
Hey, BJ, when we were discussing this one-on-one last week, you had to modify a ton of test cases to add some new attributes. Right. And I'm just wondering in general, is there anyone in this group who can respond? Is it necessary to pass all attributes, or can some of them just default? Because it seems like it makes test case maintenance a real chore. If we had 10 times as many test cases, it would be horrible. Can't attributes just be optional in the site API, and are we maybe making more work for ourselves?
They are optional. They are not a key. If they are action attributes, they are optional.
And
so wouldn't the meter be an optional?
Well, yeah, and the how come the API was testing for the number of attributes? Was that an artifact of our implementation?
No, it's not the API. I think it's the implementation.
Scilab, for BMV. But Marian, one question there was that, we have that match params and actual params check assert, right? I was hitting that if the test cases are missing the attributes. But is there any way to make it like an optional attribute and not do the increment the match params?
Yes. So again, if you look at the API alone, it says clearly which attributes are mandatory on create and which are not and are provided with the default value. Implementation may not follow that, and this is a bug.
Yeah, that
So
BJ, we might want to look into that because this sets a precedent. And it's great that you update all those test cases, but I feel bad for you because it was so much work.
yeah.
We worked
No,
on it.
so yeah, I couldn't find that where is the what makes the attribute mandatory or not mandatory? Is it this one? Okay.
Yeah, the flag
So
mandatory on create means that it's mandatory.
mandatory. No, but this
That's
is
generated from, if you
yeah,
look at
but I
icon,
think
there
we are
is
talking
optional
about
there,
this
right?
one. Yeah, this is we are talking about this attribute, right? Create
Yeah,
and
so
set.
so it's not mandatory. It can be passed on create, or it can be. You see, there is a default value. No.
Okay, so okay, just the presence of this means that it's not mandatory. Yeah, I guess we need to then update the generator because the generator is like blindly doing that to match
Probably.
params.
Mhm,
Yeah,
mhm.
okay.
Do you think we ought to
Okay.
try to fix that in this PR so we set it straight, or you want to do that as after the fact?
No, I can look into that so we can get the CI/CD going, right?
And if that's the case, you're welcome to revert those test cases, just
Yeah,
leave mandatory or put them in. I mean, because you've done the work and it's another regression test.
sure. Yeah.
And,
Vijay, this override, is it, sorry, Chris, you were saying something?
oh no, go ahead, Bishma.
The override, is this
Mhm.
also part of the meter policy table? Where does this
No,
get written from?
this is only part of the mapping because
Mhm.
the mapping comes later in the
After,
pipeline.
yeah.
Yeah, so
Just wondering where it comes from.
so I think the requirement was like if you have private link mappings, then you want the meter class to be taken from the private link mappings as opposed to what is coming from the routing. So for example, in a VNet, you can have a route which has a meter class and it points to a mapping table, which can have regular mappings and it can also have private link mappings. So for the
Mhm.
regular mappings, you want the meter class which is coming from the outbound routing table. But for the private link mappings, because they're built differently, you want the meter class coming from the mapping entry. So that is
Mhm.
the use case for this override.
Okay, the controller has to write. Oh, okay. So you're saying this override is constant.
Yeah, it's a Boolean. Yeah,
Okay.
which is, yeah.
Okay, so it doesn't need to be written from the controller point of view.
No, this has to come from the top. So if it's a
Mhm.
private link mapping, then the controller will set this particular meter class override.
Right,
When
that's what
it's,
I was thinking. So where does this come from in our implementation? It's not part of the policy table. Will this be a separate table or ENI table? Where is it coming from?
No, it comes from the outbound CA to mapping, CA to PA mapping. So like in the GNMI, yeah, here we added this one, the outbound override meter, this one.
Oh, okay.
wouldn't
Yeah,
this be redundant with the fact that the metering class has been programmed? Like, I don't see a case where you would program a meter class,
Mhm.
but you don't override.
uh, you don't override. I think I think the Boolean here is to make sure. So the case here is like if you have a non-PL mapping, it can have its own meter class, but it can still hit. It can come from a route which does not have any meter class specified, right? So
It might be zone because of availability zone or something. There could be a meter class which is only valid if it is within the VNet, if not.
right.
Hey, Vijay, I have a question about the meter table.
Mhm.
There are two keys in it. There's the policy ID and the IP address.
Right.
Should the IP address allow for IPv6 as well?
So, yeah, I think in BMV2, there was an issue. The SI API itself allows for the IPv6 address because it is SI IP address type. But in BMV2, it is V4. Yeah, I think there was some issue with when I tried to use the IP SI, just the prefix type. The generic V4 or V6, there's one field called V4 or V6 in BMV2. When we try to use that in a ternary match, it doesn't like it. And there's also inbound routing table, which is kind of doing a similar thing. Yeah, but I think this is probably another thing which we need to fix in here and in other places also.
Okay.
Is the default action deny? Is that what the intention?
I see default only deny.
Okay, so I thought, okay, this was metering mainly for the accounting purpose.
Yeah.
So maybe you're wondering if it should be like a no op action instead,
Right.
or increment some default counter index or something.
Yeah, I think so too. So I think this is probably yeah, an artifact from the ACL rule table. So yeah, I don't think we
Could
should
check
be
with
denying
friends.
packets if a
Yeah.
meter rule doesn't match. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Let me look at that as well.
Okay. It's such a big PR. It's tough to look at all the lines. Were we at the end, VJ?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much done. So
Okay.
I've just talked about everything that I have, and I've also taken notes on a few of
Okay.
the comments, and I'll
Okay.
address that.
Okay. All right. And I've connected you with Andy there. And guys, do you think this was enough time to go over this, or do you want to have 10 minutes in the next call for this, or the next BMV2 call for this? What do you think? Well, if you have comments on it, I guess put a suggestion in the PR, or ping VJ to take a look at something if there's a question. We're at 11:16. Did you have something, Reshma?
No, I think for now it looks good, and then if there are any comments, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
we'll add it here
Can
into
bring
the
it
PR.
back. Yeah. Yep. Okay. And so I think we're at time if you guys don't have anything else. And today's Thursday, so day before Friday. I'll go ahead and stop the recording.